When the clock struck 8, the boardroom was already heavy with silence. Not the kind that comforts, but the kind that warns. Every breath, every rustle of paper seemed too loud beneath the sharp lights of Hawthorne Dynamics. At the head of the table sat Alexander Hawthorne, a man who didn't need to raise his voice to be feared. His silence did the work for him. No one dared speak unless spoken to. No one, until her. Claire Bennett, the temporary cleaning worker. 3 weeks. That's all she was supposed to last. But that morning, when the Millionaire CEO demanded she clean the invisible stain, she lifted her eyes and said quietly, "There's no stain, sir." The room fell still. No whisper, no movement, just the sound of truth hanging in the air. And in that moment, something cracked inside the kingdom of silence he had built. This isn't a story about wealth or status. It's about what happens when someone who has nothing dares to speak to someone who has everything, and how a single honest voice can change even the coldest heart. So, tonight, let's step inside that room and listen to what was said when the silence finally broke. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, releasing a hush that didn't belong to morning. Inside the glass tower of Hawthorne Dynamics, even the air seemed to hold its breath. No chatter, no footsteps that dared sound too loud. Only the faint hum of computers and the echo of polished shoes across the marble floor. At precisely 8:00 the CEO's office door opened. Alexander Hawthorne stepped out tall, composed, a figure carved from control. His suit was charcoal, his tie immaculate, his silence sharper than any reprimand. People straightened instantly. A man dropped his pen, and the sound clattered like thunder. Alexander's gaze shifted just a glance, and the man bent to pick it up with trembling hands. No one spoke when Alexander walked by. He didn't need to raise his voice. He ruled by the weight of quiet. That quiet stretched across every floor, through every meeting, until it became the company's heartbeat. Some called it discipline. Most called it fear. Behind the tinted glass of the boardroom, 30 executives waited. The long table gleamed under the light, not a paper out of place. Alexander entered, nodded once, and the meeting began. He didn't greet anyone. He didn't smile. He simply sat down, folded his hands, and waited. "Good morning, Mr. Hawthorne," ventured the head of finance. The man's voice wavered. Alexander didn't answer. He simply opened the report. Pages turned soft, deliberate. A single correction mark in red ink stopped his hand. He looked up, expression unreadable. Who approved this? No one spoke. Eyes darted across the table, seeking someone to take the fall. Finally, a woman at the far end raised her hand slightly. I did, sir. I reviewed it last night." A pause, long enough to stretch into something unbearable. "Then you should have seen the discrepancy," Alexander said quietly. No anger, no raised tone, just that even voice, the kind that made every syllable feel like a verdict. The woman's shoulders sagged. He signed the paper, placed it aside. "You're excused." She stood, hands shaking. Her chair scraped softly against the floor. No one looked up as she left. The door closed. Silence swallowed the room again. Outside, whispers traveled faster than sound. Another one gone, just like that. They said he once fired a man for a misplaced comma in a presentation, that he could end a career with a single glance, that he hadn't smiled in years, not since the day his father died and left him the company. Power, in his hands, had turned into armor. And silence his weapon, from his office window. Alexander looked down at the city stretching 12 miles in every direction. Everything moved according to schedule, everything in order. Yet, the more perfect it became, the less he felt inside it. A knock at the door broke the stillness. "Mr. Hawthorne," said his assistant, her tone carefully measured. "Your driver is ready for the 10 o'clock inspection on the top floor." He nodded, closing his laptop. "Tell maintenance to double their shifts this week," he said. "No excuses for delay." "Yes, sir." By the time he reached the 27th floor, the cleaning crew had already lined the hallway, uniforms crisp, eyes lowered. One of them, a young woman with a name tag slightly tilted, stood apart, holding a mop and a bucket. Her gloves were too big. The smell of disinfectant clung to her sleeves. Alexander barely noticed her as he passed. He noticed everything else: the smudge on the glass door, the faint streak on the polished floor, but not her face. She stepped aside quickly, keeping her head down. He entered the conference room, his reflection following him across the walls of glass. Inside, the table gleamed, perfect, until his gaze caught something: a shadow, a faint blur near the edge of the polished wood. "Get someone to clean this," he said, voice low but absolute. The supervisor hurried out, returning moments later with the same woman. She moved quietly, her steps small, careful not to draw attention. Her eyes, though steady. He stood back, arms crossed, watching as she wiped the surface. She worked with care, circular motions, silent as breath. But when she finished, she didn't leave. She looked once more at the table, then at him. "There isn't a stain, sir," she said softly. "It's just the reflection." The words were simple. But in that room where no one ever spoke without permission, they landed like thunder. The supervisor froze. The other workers stopped breathing. Alexander looked at her, surprised. For a moment, he thought she might have misspoken, but her face didn't flinch. He stepped closer. "What did you say?" She met his gaze, not defiant, not timid, just honest. "I said the table is clean. What you saw was the light from the window." Silence again, not the kind he controlled. This one belonged to her. Something in the air shifted, faint, but real. He could have fired her right there. Everyone expected it. But instead, Alexander only watched her gather her things, her hands steady. When she turned to leave, he caught himself speaking almost against his own rules. "What's your name?" She hesitated, then said quietly, "Claire Bennett." He nodded once. She walked out, the door closing behind her with a soft click. For a long time, Alexander stood there, eyes on the polished surface of the table. There was no stain, only his own reflection, clear, sharp, and for the first time, strangely unfamiliar. Outside, life resumed its rhythm. Phones rang, elevators chimed, the hum of productivity returned. But somewhere in that silence he had ruled for years, a hairline crack had formed, and though no one saw it yet, the sound of it, faint as a whisper, would change everything. The night after the boardroom incident, Claire sat by the small window of her rented room in the Queens. The city hummed below, restless and bright, but inside her room, everything was still. The fluorescent light flickered once, then steadied, casting a pale glow on the stack of bills spread across the table. Medical forms, rent receipts, bus schedules, her quiet battlefield. Her phone buzzed. A message from the nurse at the clinic back home. "Your mother's blood pressure dropped again. We'll monitor through the night." Claire's chest tightened. She typed a "thank you," added a heart, and stared at the screen until it dimmed. She could almost hear her mother's voice, weak but always trying to sound brave. "Don't worry about me, honey. Just do your best." Her best. That was all she had left. 3 weeks. That's how long the cleaning contract lasted. It was supposed to be a bridge away to keep the lights on, to pay for her mother's medication, to stay afloat until something better came along. But in this city, bridges often turned into waiting rooms, and waiting could stretch forever. She folded the bills, placed them in a neat pile, and sat back. Her reflection in the window looked older than 28 tired eyes, calloused hands, the faint outline of hope still holding on. She closed her eyes, letting the hum of traffic lull her thoughts into something softer. Tomorrow would start early again. At 5:30 a.m., the alarm buzzed. The alarm. Claire dressed quietly, gray uniform, hair tied, shoes still damp from the night before. She carried her lunch in a paper bag and walked 3 blocks to the bus stop. The autumn air bit at her cheeks. The streets smelled of coffee and wet pavement. On the ride downtown, she watched the skyline rise, mile by mile, from the fog, glass towers gleaming in the early light, promising everything she could never afford. When the bus stopped near the Hawthorne building, she took a deep breath. Inside, the marble floors gleamed again. Every reflection reminded her how invisible she was here. People passed without looking, suits, heels, sharp perfumes trailing behind. Sometimes she wondered if invisibility was a skill she'd perfected or a curse she'd accepted. "Morning, Claire," murmured Maria, another cleaner, stacking supplies. "Morning." Claire smiled faintly. It was the only moment of warmth before the day began. By 7, the building woke up. Phones rang, elevators chimed, conversations hushed when the CEO's footsteps echoed down the hall. The memory of yesterday's boardroom whisper still floated among the staff. The girl who talked back. Claire pretended not to hear. She worked quietly, wiping glass walls, organizing files people left behind, polishing metal frames until she could see her own reflection disappear in them. She didn't regret what she'd said. It hadn't been courage, it had been truth. And truth didn't always wait for permission. Still. Her stomach tightened each time she heard his name, Alexander Hawthorne. She hadn't planned to challenge him. She hadn't planned anything at all. But when she saw the stain that didn't exist and his cold eyes demanding obedience, something in her refused to bend. At noon, she ate her sandwich in the maintenance room, white bread, peanut butter, a bruised apple. The others talked softly about families, about sending money home, about how expensive everything was now. Claire listened, nodding, her thoughts drifting to the hospital room she hadn't seen in months. When the lunch bell chimed, she stood, washed her hands, and caught her reflection in the small metal sink. Her face was ordinary, unremarkable, but her eyes, they still held that quiet, stubborn light. By mid-afternoon, her body ached. Her hands smelled of lemon cleaner. She leaned on her mop for a second, breathing through the fatigue, through the glass. She saw executives walking briskly, carrying laptops like shields. None of them noticed the girl behind the cart, and yet, one did. At the far end of the corridor, Alexander Hawthorne stepped out of his office. For a fleeting second, their eyes met through the glass. She looked away first, heart jumping, pretending to rearrange supplies. He didn't speak, didn't gesture, but something in his gaze lingered curious, calculating, maybe even human. She waited for the reprimand that never came. That evening, after the office emptied and the lights dimmed, she wiped the boardroom table again, the same one from yesterday. Her fingers traced the smooth surface, the line of her own faint reflection. She thought of the look in his eyes, the quiet weight of power she had felt pressing against her spine. "You shouldn't have said anything," Maria had warned her. "I know," Claire had replied, "but if I didn't, I wouldn't be me." Her voice had been calm then, but now, alone in the darkened room, her heart trembled at the memory. What if he decided tomorrow she was a problem to remove? What if her honesty cost her the only paycheck she had? Still, she smiled to herself. There were worse things than losing a job. Losing yourself that was harder to recover from. She gathered her tools, turned off the lights, and stood for a moment by the window. The city glittered below like 1,000 small promises. She thought of her mother, of the way she used to hum softly while folding laundry, of her hands that had worked all her life without complaint. Claire placed her hand over her heart, a quiet vow. She would make it, somehow. Behind her, in the reflection of the dark glass, a figure appeared briefly at the far end of the hall, tall, motionless, watching Alexander. He didn't move closer. He only watched her leave. And as she disappeared into the elevator's glow, he caught his own reflection in the glass, the faint outline of a man who ruled everything, yet suddenly didn't understand why he couldn't stop thinking about the silence that followed her voice. Outside, the night deepened, somewhere between fear and respect, between two very different worlds. Something had shifted too quietly for anyone to name, but strong enough to change what came next. And for the first time in years, Alexander Hawthorne didn't feel certain of who he was. Morning light slid across the glass walls of the 32nd floor, thin and pale like a blade. The air inside the conference room smelled faintly of polish and paper too clean, too still. People spoke in murmurs, shuffling reports, adjusting chairs. The room waited, the way people do before a storm. Then came the sound that made everyone straighten the low click of the CEO's shoes. Alexander Hawthorne entered without a word. He didn't need one. Silence walked in with him. He set his phone down, placed his pen exactly parallel to the edge of the table, then scanned the surface in front of him. His gaze caught on something a glimmer, a shimmer, maybe just the sun reflecting from the window. But to him, it looked like imperfection. He frowned. Who cleaned this table? No one answered. The question hung in the air, heavy as judgment. Finally, the maintenance supervisor stepped forward. Sir, that would be Ms. Bennett. Bring her. A minute later, the door opened again. Claire stepped in quietly, her gloved hands folded in front of her, the faint scent of disinfectant following. The executives looked down at their papers, pretending to read. She could feel their unease like heat on her skin. Alexander pointed to the center of the table. Wipe that again. Claire looked where he pointed, nothing but gleaming wood, smooth and flawless. But she walked closer, because that was what you did when a man like him gave an order. She took out a clean cloth, pressed it gently, rubbed in slow circles. The sound of fabric against varnish was the only thing moving in the room. When she finished, the surface shone brighter than before. She stepped back, nodded once. It's clean, sir. Alexander's eyes stayed on the same spot. Do it again. Something in her chest tightened. She could feel every eye on her waiting for her to obey, waiting for her to shrink. She inhaled slowly, steadying her voice. There's no stain, sir. It was almost a whisper, but it carried. The words broke through the air like a stone dropped into still water. Someone coughed, papers rustled. The room went utterly still again. Alexander turned his gaze to her. For a moment, the whole floor seemed to hold its breath. No one had spoken to him like that in years, perhaps ever. He studied her face, calm but unyielding. There was no defiance there, only truth. And truth, when spoken in a place built on fear, had a strange kind of power. He stepped closer, his voice low. Excuse me. She met his eyes steady, respectful, but unafraid. There isn't a mark. Sir, what you're seeing is the reflection from the window. A soft murmur rippled through the room, quickly silenced when Alexander lifted his head. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The faintest muscle near his temple moved, then stilled. Claire waited. The silence between them stretched, taut and electric. Then, slowly, he set the pen down, turned slightly toward the window. The light had shifted, the reflection disappeared. His eyes flicked back to the table, then to her. You're dismissed, he said finally. Yes, sir. She gathered her cloth and turned toward the door, but her legs felt heavy, her pulse too loud. She could feel the gazes following her, some pitying, some admiring, most afraid for her. The door closed softly behind her. Inside, the meeting resumed, but the rhythm was broken. No one spoke for a long time until Alexander finally said, Continue. Even then, his voice was quieter, his tone unreadable. He didn't hear a word of the next presentation. His mind kept returning to the image of her standing there, small but unshaken, speaking truth without raising her voice. The honesty of it unsettled him. Later that afternoon, as the last report ended and the room emptied, he stayed behind. The light had changed again, slipping into gold. He looked at the table, now spotless, now ordinary. He placed his hand over the wood, felt the smoothness, the faint warmth left by sunlight. No stain, no flaw, only his own reflection looking back at him, cold, tired, questioning. Downstairs. Claire walked through the lobby, the echo of her footsteps faint against the marble. The The security guard gave her a sympathetic nod. "You okay, miss?" She managed a smile. "I think so." Her hands were trembling inside the gloves. She wasn't sure if it was fear or relief. She'd spoken, just once, and for a moment the silence of that entire floor had cracked open. But now, reality pressed in again. She was still just a temporary worker, a name on a short contract. People like her didn't challenge people like him. Not twice. She stepped outside. The autumn wind caught her hair, carried away the faint scent of lemon cleaner. She looked up at the towering glass of Hawthorne Dynamics, catching a brief reflection of the sky on its surface. Somewhere inside, that man was probably still sitting in silence, surrounded by everything he thought he controlled. She took a deep breath and whispered to herself, "It's just a job." But deep down, she knew it wasn't just that. Something had shifted, though she couldn't name it. Upstairs, Alexander finally turned off the lights in the boardroom. As he stepped out, he glanced once more at the table. The reflection returned, faint but clear. This time, he didn't call anyone to clean it. In the dim glass, his face looked different, less certain, more human. He straightened his tie, exhaled softly, and left. That night, as the city lights flickered against the clouds, two people on opposite sides of power lay awake, one wondering if she had gone too far, the other wondering why her voice still echoed in his mind. Somewhere between them, in the quiet space where pride meets truth, something fragile and unstoppable had begun. For most of his life, Alexander Hawthorne had learned that silence was control, and control was safety. It kept things predictable, contained, manageable. But that morning, as the elevator doors closed behind him, silence did not feel like control at all. It felt unsettled. He could still hear her voice in his mind, soft, but certain. "There's no stain, sir." It was ridiculous, almost laughable, that a few words from a cleaning worker could echo louder than the entire board's opinions. Yet they did. They followed him into the elevator, into his car, into his thoughts. He leaned back against the cool leather seat of the company car, loosening his tie ever so slightly. To headquarters, his driver asked, "Yes." The answer came automatic, though his mind wasn't there. He watched the city slide by towers of glass, reflecting light like blades. Streets full of people who looked everywhere except at each other. He had built his empire here, in this city of noise, and yet somehow a single voice had cut through all of it. When he arrived at his private floor, his assistant, Evelyn, met him with her usual clipboard and crisp smile. "Morning, Mr. Hawthorne. Your 10 o'clock with the finance division is waiting. Would you like coffee before we begin?" He gave a distracted nod. "Black, no sugar." "Yes, sir." She paused, glancing briefly at his expression. "Is everything all right? Perfectly?" It wasn't. In the meeting, numbers filled the screen, voices droned on, and he sat there, outwardly composed but inwardly restless. He should have forgotten the incident already. It was nothing, a trivial exchange between a CEO and a cleaner, but the way she had looked at him, not with fear, not with insolence, but with something else, conviction, maybe, or clarity. He didn't know. He only knew that it bothered him. He caught himself staring at the polished conference table again. No stain, just his reflection. His own gaze stared back, unreadable. When the meeting ended, he dismissed everyone early. "Send the reports to my office. I'll review them later." Evelyn hesitated at the door. "Sir, about the new maintenance hire." He didn't look up. "The cleaning staff." "Yes, Claire Bennett. She's on a temporary 3-week contract." He remembered the name instantly. It sounded too delicate for the steel in her eyes. "Keep her on schedule," he said flatly. Then, after a pause, added, "We'll see how long she lasts." It was meant to sound indifferent, but even to his own ears, it didn't. That afternoon, while walking through the operations floor, he caught sight of her again. She was kneeling beside a supply cart, stacking bottles by color, humming softly a tune too faint to name. People walked around her as if she were part of the furniture. She didn't seem to notice or care. There was a quiet dignity to the way she moved, focused, efficient, unhurried. He stopped a few feet away. "Miss Bennet?" She froze, then rose quickly, eyes widening. "Sir," he pointed to a small smudge on the wall near the elevator. Take care of it." She nodded and reached for a cloth. As she cleaned, he watched her reflection in the glass. Her hands were steady, her movements careful. She didn't rush. When she finished, she turned to him, waiting for his approval. "It's fine," he said, then added almost without thinking, "You're thorough." Her brows lifted slightly, as if she wasn't sure whether it was praise or sarcasm. "I try to be," she said simply. He gave a short nod. "Keep it that way." As he walked off, she stood there for a moment, watching him leave. There was something strange about that man, the way he carried silence like armor, yet seemed haunted by it. She couldn't explain why she'd spoken up to him the day before. Maybe because no one else would. Maybe because she'd spent too many years watching powerful men pretend that fear was respect. By evening, the office emptied again. Alexander stood by his window, staring out at the skyline. The sun was setting long shadows stretching across the city like dark veins. He loosened his cuffs, took off his watch, and placed it neatly beside his laptop. In the reflection on the glass, he could almost see the boardroom again, the circle of faces, the quiet tension, and her standing there, refusing to bow. He remembered how steady her voice had been. No tremor, no apology. It intrigued him. "Evelyn," he said suddenly, pressing the intercom. "Yes, sir. Find out where she's assigned tomorrow. Miss Bennet." There was a brief silence. Of course. He didn't explain why. He wasn't sure himself. Maybe he wanted to make sure she didn't cause more trouble. Maybe he just wanted to understand what kind of person could speak truth to power and still go back to polishing tables as if nothing happened. That night, as he drove home, the city lights flickered across the car windows. He tried to focus on the usual things: quarterly reports, upcoming deals, investor meetings, but his thoughts kept circling back to that moment, her eyes meeting his without flinching. He had built a world where everyone nodded, agreed, obeyed, where silence was safety. And yet, for the first time in years, someone had refused to play the game, and somehow, that refusal had not angered him. It had woken something he didn't recognize. When he reached his penthouse, he poured himself a glass of whiskey, the amber light catching the rim of the crystal. He stared at the city from the wide windows, thousands of tiny lights burning in the dark, somewhere out there. She was probably walking to a bus stop, exhausted but unbroken. He found himself wondering what it would take to survive in her world, one where nothing was guaranteed, where every day was earned inch by inch. He took a slow sip, the silence in his apartment pressing around him. Then, for reasons he couldn't explain, he said aloud, "We'll see how long she lasts." But his voice didn't sound cold this time. It sounded curious, almost human. Outside, the city kept breathing, lights flickering, cars passing, people hurrying home. And inside that tall glass kingdom, the man who ruled through silence found himself listening for a voice that had dared to break it. By Wednesday morning, the air inside Hawthorne Dynamics had changed. It wasn't loud, it never was, but something unseen stirred beneath the quiet order. The kind of tension that moved between whispers and glances. Claire felt it before she even reached her floor. The elevator doors slid open, and conversations that had been going just a moment before stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned, eyes flicked toward her, then away just as quickly. She didn't need to guess why. In offices like this, stories move faster than light, and truth always traveled dressed as rumor. Someone must have told someone, who told someone else, until the whole building knew the cleaning girl talked back to the CEO. As she pushed her cart down the corridor, she caught fragments. Is that her? The one who corrected him? He didn't fire her. Maybe he didn't hear her right. Claire kept her eyes forward. She'd learned long ago that people's opinions didn't pay bills. When she reached the glass conference room, the same one where it all began, She paused. The table gleamed under the white lights. No stain, no reflection, just her faint silhouette bending over the surface again. She pressed her hand to the smooth wood for a moment, not to clean, just to steady herself. For everyone else, it was a rumor. For her, it was just a moment, one small act of honesty that somehow had grown legs and walked the halls. She sighed and picked up her cloth. Work was the only thing that felt real here. The smell of lemon polish, the sound of her own breathing, the soft rhythm of movement. Those were things she could control, but the silence around her wasn't the same anymore. It wasn't ignorance, it was awareness. She could feel eyes on her from behind the glass, curious and cautious, some admiring, some waiting to see her fall. In the break room, Maria slid her a cup of coffee and whispered, "They're calling you brave, you know." Claire smiled faintly. "Or foolish. Same thing. Sometimes," Maria said, shrugging. Claire sipped the coffee bitter, strong, exactly how she liked it. "I didn't mean to make a scene. I know," Maria said softly. "That's why it worked." Claire didn't answer. She looked out the window instead, at the long shadow of the Hawthorne Tower stretching across the street below. Somewhere up there, in his glass office, Alexander Hawthorne was probably drinking his perfect black coffee, untouched by gossip. Or maybe he wasn't. Maybe he'd heard too. She tried not to care. She was here to work, not to matter. But truth has its own way of echoing, even when no one repeats it out loud. By noon, the story had evolved. Some said the CEO had smiled. Others swore he'd been furious. Someone claimed he'd told his assistant to keep an eye on her. Everyone had a version, and none of them were true. What was true was simpler. A woman had spoken. A man had listened. And the building hadn't been the same since. That afternoon, while scrubbing the railing near the executive elevators, she caught sight of him again. Alexander, alone, no entourage, no assistant trailing behind. Just him, walking with that same deliberate calm. Their eyes met for the briefest second. He didn't look angry. He looked thoughtful, as if he were still puzzling over something that wouldn't leave his mind. He gave a small nod so subtle she almost thought she'd imagined it. Claire lowered her gaze and stepped aside to let him pass. When the elevator doors closed behind him, her pulse slowed, but not her thoughts. She wondered if he even remembered her name. Later, in the maintenance corridor, a young intern stopped her. His tie was crooked, his hands full of folders. "Excuse me," he said nervously. "I just wanted to say, what you did was kind of amazing." Claire blinked, unsure how to respond. "I just told the truth." "Yeah," he said with a sheepish grin. "That's the amazing part." When he walked away, she stood there for a long time, feeling a strange mixture of warmth and unease. She didn't want to be anyone's symbol. She just wanted to keep her job. That evening, the building emptied out one floor at a time. The lights dimmed, the hum of computers faded. Claire stayed behind, finishing her last round. She preferred this hour when the silence was gentle, not tense, when the city lights began to mirror themselves across the glass, turning the office into a reflection of another world. She moved from room to room, humming softly under her breath. On the 32nd floor, she found a forgotten jacket on a chair, dark wool, tailored. She folded it neatly, knowing exactly whose it was. For a moment, she hesitated, then draped it carefully over the back of his chair in the corner office. There was something oddly human about it, the thought that even men like him left things behind sometimes. She turned to leave, but stopped at the door, from the hallway. She could hear muffled voices, two executives talking near the elevator. "Did you hear about the cleaning girl once said? She won't last. Nobody crosses him twice. Still, took guts. Maybe that's why he hasn't fired her yet." Their laughter faded down the hall. Claire exhaled slowly. She wasn't sure if she wanted to be brave or invisible anymore. Both seemed equally dangerous here. She walked back to the cart, her shoes soft against the carpet. The city glittered far below, each light a life she'd never know. And somewhere in that sea of glass and sky, the truth kept moving, not loud, not fast, but steady. She closed her eyes for a second, letting the quiet settle around her. Maybe truth didn't need to shout to be heard. Maybe it just needed someone to stop pretending not to see it. As she turned off the last light, a faint reflection caught her eye, her own shadow overlapping with the tall outline of his jacket behind the glass. For a heartbeat, they looked like two people standing side by side. Then she blinked, and the image was gone. Outside, the night carried her home. Inside, the rumor kept walking the halls softer now, but alive, like a whisper that refused to die. And somewhere high above, in his silent office, Alexander Hawthorne sat staring at his reflection again, wondering how a single truth had managed to travel faster than every word he'd ever spoken. The summons came just before noon. Claire was cleaning the glass panels near the reception desk when Evelyn, the CEO's assistant, approached. Her heels clicked lightly on the marble, her voice calm but formal. "Miss Bennett, Mr. Hawthorne would like to see you." In his office? For a moment, Claire thought she'd misheard. Her grip on the cloth tightened. "Me? Yes." Evelyn gave a polite nod. "Now? Please." The air seemed to shift around her. Conversations dimmed. A few coworkers looked up from their screens, curiosity flickering across their faces. No one got called to the top floor, especially not the cleaning staff. Claire wiped her hands on her uniform, straightened her collar, and followed. The elevator ride felt longer than usual. Each floor number glowed and vanished, one after another, until only silence remained. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat. When the doors opened, the quiet on the executive level was different dense, like air inside a sealed room. Evelyn led her to the glass office at the end of the hall. "He's expecting you," she said softly. Claire nodded, then stepped inside. Alexander Hawthorne stood by the window, his back to her, the skyline stretching wide behind him. Sunlight poured through the glass, outlining him in a pale edge of gold. For a moment, he didn't speak. He just watched the city, hands folded loosely behind his back. "Close the door," he said. She did. The sound of the latch felt louder than it should have. He turned then, calm, composed, but his eyes carried that sharp, analytical focus she remembered from the boardroom. "Miss Bennett." "Yes, sir." He studied her for a moment. "You've been with us. A week, 8 days," she said quietly. He nodded once. "And in that time, you've become something of a legend." She frowned slightly. "I didn't mean to. I know." His tone was even almost detached. "But you did." The silence stretched. Claire waited, unsure what he wanted from her. He finally moved from the window and gestured toward a chair. "Sit." She hesitated. "I'm fine standing, sir." That wasn't a suggestion. She sat, keeping her posture straight. Her hands rested in her lap. Alexander leaned against his desk, arms crossed. "Tell me something," he said slowly. "What kind of person do you think I am?" The question caught her off guard. She blinked, searching his face for irony, for a trap. But his expression was unreadable. "I don't think it's my place to say." He tilted his head slightly. "You spoke your mind once before. I'd like to hear it again." Her pulse quickened. She could feel the weight of his gaze steady, demanding honesty. Something inside her hesitated, but something else refused to shrink. After a long pause, she said softly, "I think you're a man who confuses control with leadership." The words came out calm, even, but in the quiet room, they struck like thunder. Alexander's eyes narrowed, not in anger, more like surprise, as if he'd been expecting defiance, not truth. "Explain," he said. She took a slow breath. "Control keeps people quiet. It makes them efficient, afraid, predictable. But leadership," she looked up at him. "Leadership earns trust. It gives people a reason to stay even when they could walk away." He didn't move. His face stayed composed, but his hand flexed slightly against the edge of the desk. Her words hung in the air between them, simple, unadorned, and impossible to ignore. For years, his authority had gone unquestioned. He had been called brilliant, demanding, visionary. No one had ever dared to name what his silence truly was, a wall built to keep himself untouched. And now, a temporary worker had seen through it with a single sentence. He turned away, pacing once toward the window. "You're bold," he said finally. Claire's voice stayed quiet. "I'm honest." He looked over his shoulder. "And you think honesty is enough to survive here? I think it's the only thing that makes surviving worth it." For a moment, he almost smiled, not the polite, practiced kind, but something smaller, almost involuntary. Then it vanished. "You realize most people wouldn't speak to me that way." "I know," she said. "That's probably why most people are afraid of you." That time, the silence was heavier, but it didn't feel hostile. It felt like the air just before something begins to crack. He turned fully then, leaning closer across the desk. "You think I built this company on fear?" Claire didn't look away. "I think you built it on control, and maybe somewhere along the way. You forgot that they're not the same thing." His jaw tightened, but his eyes didn't leave hers. The strange thing was, he wasn't angry. He was listening. Really listening. And for the first time in years, he didn't have a ready answer. He exhaled, low and unsteady. "You're dismissed," he said at last. She rose, nodding politely. "Thank you, sir." But as she reached the door, his voice stopped her. "Miss Bennett," she turned. His gaze had softened, just slightly. "Most people, when they look at me, they see what I expect them to see. You didn't." "Why?" She hesitated, her hand on the door. "Because sometimes people need to be seen for who they could be, not just who they've become." He stood still, saying nothing, but something flickered behind his expression, a fracture, faint and real. Claire stepped out quietly, the door closing with a soft click. Inside. Alexander remained where he was. The city stretched endlessly below him, but his focus stayed fixed on the reflection in the glass. Her words replayed in his mind, each one precise, measured, impossible to dismiss. A man who confuses control with leadership. He'd spent his life mastering silence, but suddenly, silence felt different, not like power, like absence. He looked down at his hands, steady, practiced, built for command, for the first time. He wondered what they might look like if they weren't always clenched around control. Outside his office, the rhythm of work went on, phones ringing, elevators chiming, conversations murmuring back to life. But inside that glass room, something invisible had shifted. The first crack in the wall had formed, and through it, a single ray of light began to find its way in. That night, Alexander didn't go home. He stayed in his office long after the city below had gone dark. His reflection caught between the lights outside and the shadows inside. Papers were scattered across the desk untouched. His coffee had gone cold hours ago. And yet, he just sat there, elbows on the table, fingertips pressed against his forehead. Her words kept looping in his mind like a song he couldn't forget. A man who confuses control with leadership. He had brushed it off earlier, pretended it was just an opinion. But now, alone in the quiet, the sentence kept breathing. And then another voice followed hers again, softer this time, almost like memory. People don't leave because the work is hard. They leave because they're not allowed to breathe. He'd spent decades building this empire, brick by brick, rule by rule, every policy, every decision, shaped by the belief that discipline created excellence, that fear created focus. But what if he'd been wrong? What if the silence he'd demanded was not strength, but suffocation? He leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed. Through the glass, the lights of the city blurred into streaks. His mind drifted back to his father, the man whose shadow he'd lived in, the man who'd built this company before him. His father's voice was always sharp in memory. Never let them see weakness. Alex, respect comes from distance. Control the room, or you lose it. Control the room. He'd done that. Too well. He thought about the woman he'd dismissed earlier that morning, the one who'd spoken truth without raising her voice. There had been no malice in her tone, no defiance, just honesty, the kind of honesty no one had offered him in years. For the first time in a long while, Alexander felt something unfamiliar. It wasn't anger, it was fatigue, deep, quiet exhaustion that came not from work, but from the weight of being feared. Downstairs, Claire was finishing her shift. The floors gleamed under the soft lights, her reflection stretching in the polished marble. Her hands were raw from cleaning, her mind still replaying the moment in his office. She hadn't meant to say so much, but when he'd asked her that question, something inside her had refused to lie. She didn't know what he would do. Maybe he'd fire her tomorrow. Maybe he wouldn't. Either way, she'd spoken the truth, and that felt like enough. When she left the building, the wind outside was sharp with the scent of rain. She pulled her coat tight and walked toward the bus stop, the city humming around her, behind her, far above. One window on the top floor was still lit. Alexander didn't sleep. He stood by the glass, watching the streets below, tiny dots of light moving endlessly. People living their lives without ever knowing his name. For the first time, he envied them. The freedom, the breathing. He thought of the hundreds of employees who walked into this building every day, heads bowed, voices careful, smiles measured. He had built that fear into them. He had called it respect. And now he saw what it truly was, distance. He sat back down, opened his laptop, and began scrolling through resignation letters from the past year. The numbers startled him. So many names, so many quiet departures. They hadn't left for better pay or lighter workloads. The reasons were all the same: toxic culture, burnout, no space to grow. He closed the screen, his reflection staring back at him from the dark monitor. He didn't like what he saw. The next morning, when he arrived at the office, people noticed something different. His steps were slower, his face still unreadable, but the usual edge in his eyes was gone, replaced by something quieter, maybe even human. He passed through the lobby. People straightened as always, but he didn't look through them this time. He nodded once to the receptionist, a gesture so small it almost went unnoticed. Almost upstairs. Evelyn found him standing by the window again. "Good morning, sir," she said, placing his schedule on the desk. He turned. "Morning." She froze for half a second. It was the first time he had ever said it first. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. At 10, he walked into the department meeting, the usual quiet falling like a curtain. He looked around the table, faces stiff, eyes down. The silence he'd once found powerful now felt heavy. He cleared his throat. "Before we begin," he said, "I want everyone to speak freely today." The room stayed still. Someone finally asked, "About what, sir?" "About anything," he said. "This company, the work, what's not working?" A few eyes lifted, uncertain. No one dared to go first. He waited. The silence stretched. He could feel the old instinct rising, the urge to fill it with authority. But he didn't. He let the quiet breathe. Finally, one young analyst cleared his throat. "Honestly, sir, the pace is unsustainable." Another voice joined. "People are afraid to make mistakes." And then another. "We want to do better work, but the pressure." Alexander listened, not as a CEO, not as the man in control, just as a man hearing truth for the first time in too long. By the end of the meeting, his coffee was untouched again. But this time, it didn't matter. Something had cracked, not broken, but opened. When the room emptied, he sat there alone for a while, looking at the empty chairs. The echoes of their voices still lingered, soft but alive. For years, he had ruled over silence. Now, he was learning to listen to sound. Downstairs, Claire was cleaning the same corridor as before when she saw him step out of the elevator. He nodded at her, a small gesture of acknowledgement. She nodded back, cautious but calm. As he passed, He spoke just loud enough for her to hear. "You were right, Miss Bennet. People do leave when they can't breathe." She looked up, surprised. Their eyes met not as superior and subordinate, but as two people who had finally seen each other clearly. He gave a faint, tired smile, almost an apology, almost gratitude, then continued walking down the hall. When he disappeared around the corner, Claire turned back to her cart. Her heart felt lighter somehow, though she couldn't explain why. Maybe because she'd just witnessed something rare, change the quiet kind, the kind that begins not with speeches or headlines, but with listening, upstairs, in the stillness of his office. Alexander looked out at the city again. He hadn't solved anything yet. The company was still the same machine, but for the first time, he wanted to change it, not to control it, but to lead it. He whispered to himself, almost a confession, "I'm tired of the silence." Outside, the wind swept across the skyline, carrying the faint hum of life from the streets below. And for the man who once ruled through fear, that sound felt like the first real breath he'd taken in years. The next morning arrived gray and quiet, the city still wrapped in mist. The marble lobby of Hawthorne Dynamics glowed faintly under the early lights. Phones hadn't started ringing yet. Elevators hummed softly. It was that brief, fragile moment before the building awoke, the moment Claire always loved most. She pushed her cart across the floor, the wheels whispering against the tile. The scent of coffee drifted faintly from the cafe downstairs. Somewhere, a printer clicked on. Ordinary sounds, the kind that told her another day had begun, and that she was still here. When the elevator chimed, she looked up. The doors slid open, and Alexander Hawthorne stepped out. He was alone, as usual, suit pressed, tie straight, the sound of his shoes on the floor sharp and even. Normally, when he passed through the lobby, the air would thicken. Conversations would stop mid-sentence. No one would dare to speak first. It was his kind of silence, the kind that ruled. But today, something subtle shifted. As he crossed the lobby, his gaze swept the room the way it always did, calculated, distant. Then, as he reached the front desk, his steps slowed. The receptionist, a young woman named Megan, froze halfway through her morning greeting, her voice faltering into the stillness. And then Alexander did something that made the entire floor forget to breathe. He smiled just a little and said, "Good morning." 2 words, soft, ordinary. But coming from him, they felt like an earthquake. For a second, no one moved. Megan blinked, unsure she'd heard correctly. Then she stammered, Good morning, Mr. Hawthorne." He nodded once, almost as if to himself, and continued walking toward the elevator. Behind him, whispers bloomed like ripples in water. People exchanged startled glances. Even the security guard straightened, eyebrows raised. Claire, standing by her cart near the far wall, caught the faint echo of his voice and couldn't help but smile. Sometimes, change didn't roar. Sometimes, it whispered. She watched him step into the private elevator, the doors closing behind him. The mirrored surface caught his reflection for a moment, still composed. Still the same man, yet something softer in the way he exhaled. Almost as if he was letting go of a weight no one else could see. Upstairs, Alexander entered his office, feeling an unfamiliar quiet settle inside him. Not the heavy, suffocating kind he used to command, but a lighter silence, one that allowed breath. Evelyn appeared at the door with his schedule. "You're early today, sir. I couldn't sleep," he said. Then, after a pause, "Evelyn, when was the last time I spoke to the staff personally? The lower floors. I mean," she hesitated. "I'm not sure, sir. It's been a while." He nodded. "Too long?" He turned toward the window. From this height, the people below looked like threads of light moving through the gray streets. He'd always thought distance made him strong, but now it just made him feel apart. He found himself thinking of what Claire had said again. People don't leave because the work is hard. They leave because they're not allowed to breathe. He didn't know if he believed her entirely, but he couldn't deny that her words had begun to loosen something in him. Downstairs. Claire continued her rounds. The usual greetings came differently that morning. Some smiled at her, now small, cautious smiles, like people testing new air. The rumor had changed shape again, no longer just the story of the cleaning girl who spoke back. Now it was. She's the one he didn't fire. Maria joined her near the elevators, carrying a bucket of fresh towels. "Did you see that?" she whispered. "He said good morning." Claire nodded. "I did." Maria shook her head, still stunned. "I've been here 6 years." The man barely nods. "What did you do to him?" "Nothing," Claire said, half smiling. Maybe he just needed someone to remind him he's human. Maria chuckled softly. "Careful. That kind of talk can get you promoted or fired." "Maybe both," Claire said. And they both laughed quietly before the next elevator arrived. The laughter was brief, but it lingered. It sounded almost like hope. That afternoon, the change continued in small ways. Alexander paused by the design department, asking a question instead of issuing an order. He complimented a team's progress. He even thanked someone. It wasn't grand, it wasn't performative, it was human. And because of that, it startled everyone even more. People didn't know whether to trust it, but they noticed. And down the hall, behind a half-open glass door, Claire caught sight of him again. He was talking with Evelyn, his voice quieter than usual, his posture less rigid. When he glanced her way, their eyes met briefly. He nodded a simple acknowledgement, nothing more. But for her, it was enough. She continued mopping the floor, her movements slow, steady, rhythmic. The light through the windows glowed warm across the tile, softening the edges of the day. That evening, as employees packed up to leave, someone held the elevator door for another person. Someone else offered a tired laugh instead of a forced silence. The changes were small, almost invisible, but real. When the building finally emptied, Claire finished her last round and stood for a moment in the lobby. The same space that once felt frozen now felt alive. She thought about how strange it was that a simple greeting could ripple through an entire place like this. 2 words that meant nothing, and somehow, everything. As she pushed her cart toward the exit, she looked once more at the elevator doors. Her reflection shimmered in the brushed steel. For a fleeting second, she thought she saw another reflection beside hers, taller, distant, thoughtful. She smiled, whispering under her breath, "Good night, Mr. Hawthorne." Upstairs, in his darkened office, Alexander stood alone again, the city glowing beneath him. But tonight, the silence didn't feel lonely. It felt open. He poured himself a glass of water, took a slow sip, and looked toward the faint reflection in the glass. His own face, no longer as sharp. He thought of the word he'd said that morning. Good morning, simple, ordinary. But for him, it had felt like learning to breathe again. He turned off the lights, letting the city's glow spill softly into the room. Change had begun, not loud, not sudden, but quiet and steady, like dawn rising over glass. The rhythm of the office had changed, subtly, almost imperceptibly, but those who'd been there long enough could feel it. Conversations that once died the moment Alexander Hawthorne entered now hesitated before falling silent. There were even moments brief, fragile ones when laughter dared to slip through the hallways. To some, it felt like air returning after years of holding their breath, but to others, it felt like danger. Victoria Crane sat in her corner office on the 34th floor, staring through the glass walls at the shifting pulse of the company she'd helped build. Her desk was immaculate, every pen aligned, every file tagged in the same neat handwriting she'd used since her first day. Perfection was her armor, precision her weapon. And she could feel it now, something slipping. She had served under Alexander for 15 years, knew his moods, his silences, his expectations before he even voiced them. She had built her reputation on understanding how to navigate his authority, how to mirror his coldness. Together, they had run the company like clockwork, and now, the gears were grinding because of her, Claire Bennett, the temporary cleaner who somehow had made the CEO say, "Good morning." Victoria's nails tapped lightly against her coffee cup. It wasn't anger. Not exactly, it was fear disguised as loyalty. She told herself she was protecting the company, protecting Alexander from a distraction, a weakness he didn't even see. But deep down, she knew it wasn't just that. It was jealousy. A deep, quiet jealousy that this woman, this outsider, had cracked open something Victoria had spent years preserving. That morning, she called her assistant. "Close the door," she said. The young man did as he was told, eyes careful. Victoria didn't look up. "You've heard about the cleaning girl." He hesitated. "I've heard the rumors." "Ma'am, rumors," she repeated softly, letting the word hang. "Sometimes they tell you what people are afraid to say out loud." She looked up, her expression calm, deliberate. "Start one for me." Subtle. Not malicious, just curious. Something like, "The CEO's been spending a lot of time around the cleaning staff lately." The assistant blinked. "You mean, don't overthink it," she said, her tone still smooth. "Let it breathe on its own." A whisper travels farther than a shout. He nodded quickly, understanding enough to be afraid. "Yes, ma'am." When he left, Victoria stood by the window, watching the city shimmer below. Power, she thought, was like glass strong until it cracks. And Claire Bennett was the hairline fracture she intended to seal, or break, downstairs. Claire was wiping down the glass partitions between cubicles, unaware that her name was beginning to move again. The whispers that had once carried her truth now carried something else, something uglier. She noticed it first in the way people's eyes changed when they looked at her. Curiosity turned cautious. Admiration turned into something else, something that pulled away. "At lunch," Maria whispered, "they're saying things." Claire. Claire looked up from her sandwich. "What things? That Mr. Hawthorne might be?" Maria stopped, glancing around before lowering her voice. "That he's taking an interest in you. The wrong kind." For a moment, Claire just stared. Then she laughed softly, shaking her head. "That's ridiculous. I know. But you know how people are here." She did. She knew too well. Rumors were a different kind of dirt, one that didn't wash off easily. The rest of the day moved slower. Every conversation seemed to quiet when she entered a room. Even the guards at the lobby exchanged looks when she passed. By evening, she could feel the story taking root like ivy, creeping along the walls. Upstairs, Alexander had no idea. His day had been a blur of meetings, calls, and numbers. But even he could sense the atmosphere shifting again, the glances that lasted too long, the sudden hush when he stepped into a corridor. He brushed it off until Evelyn paused outside his office that afternoon, hesitant. "Sir," she said carefully, "you might want to be aware there's been talk." He looked up. "Talk about what?" "About you and Miss Bennett." His brow furrowed. "What kind of talk?" She hesitated, choosing her words. "That you've taken a personal interest in her." For a moment, he said nothing. Then, quietly, "Who started it?" Evelyn shook her head. "Rumors rarely have names." He leaned back, expression unreadable. The absurdity of it almost made him laugh, but the anger beneath it didn't. He'd finally started to loosen the company's silence, to make people less afraid. And already, the old fear was fighting back, trying to twist something pure into something dirty. "Thank you, Evelyn," he said. "That will be all?" When she left, he stood by the window, jaw tense. He knew exactly who would want to protect the old ways. He'd built that army himself. Victoria Crane, most of all. He stayed late again that night, reviewing files that didn't need his attention, just to think. The skyline outside blurred into streaks of gold and gray. He couldn't shake the thought of Claire, how she must be hearing the same whispers. He wondered if she thought he was behind them, Downstairs, Claire was finishing her shift. She'd kept her head down all day, said little, but the weight of the rumor clung to her shoulders. She'd never been one to care about gossip, but this felt different. It wasn't just untrue, it was cruel. It made her dignity a question mark. As she pushed the mop bucket down the hall, she passed by the reflection of the executive floor in the glass above. For a moment, she saw his silhouette still there, still working. She hesitated. Then she whispered to herself, almost as if to prove something, "I'm not afraid of truth, only lies." The words steadied her. In his office, Alexander turned from the window, unaware that below him, the woman who'd changed him was now paying the price for it. He poured himself another glass of water, but it tasted bitter. The city lights flickered against the glass like small, accusing eyes. Victoria, in her own office, closed her laptop with quiet satisfaction. The rumor was already growing roots. By morning, she knew, it would bloom. Change had come to Hawthorne Dynamics, and so had resistance. And between them, somewhere in the quiet center, stood a man waking up to truth, and a woman learning how much truth can cost. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, the kind of gray, heavy day when the air feels too still to breathe. Claire was finishing her shift, wiping down the last glass wall in the conference wing, when her phone buzzed with a message from HR. "Please come to the 6th floor office immediately. Human Resources." Her hand paused mid-motion. The words looked harmless, routine, but something in her stomach tightened. The HR office was cold, spotless, and quiet when she entered. 3 people were waiting. The director of HR, a woman from compliance, and a man she didn't recognize. Probably legal. None of them smiled. "Miss Bennett," the director began, her voice careful and rehearsed. "We've received multiple reports regarding your conduct on company premises." Claire frowned, confused. "My conduct?" "Yes," the woman continued, sliding a paper across the desk. "There have been concerns about inappropriate behavior involving senior leadership." For a moment, Claire couldn't even form a reply. The words didn't fit the world she knew. "I'm sorry," she said finally, her voice low. "That's not true." The HR director folded her hands. "Regardless, until we can review the matter properly, we've decided to place you on temporary suspension." Silence filled the room, the kind that hums in your ears. Claire looked down at the paper in front of her, the official notice, neat and final, stamped with corporate authority. It didn't matter that the words were lies. The decision was already written. She felt her throat tighten, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I've done nothing wrong," she said quietly. The director's tone softened, but only slightly. "This is procedural. Miss Bennett, you'll be contacted once we've concluded our review." It wasn't about procedure. She could see it in their eyes. This was protection, not of truth, but of reputation, of him. When she walked out of the office, the corridor felt longer than usual. Every step echoed, every face she passed seemed to know something. By the time she reached the lobby, the receptionist avoided her gaze. The security guard didn't say hello. Even Maria, standing by the elevators, looked stricken. "Claire," she whispered. "What happened?" Claire just shook her head. "They said I did something I didn't do." Maria's eyes welled. "You think this is about those rumors?" Claire managed a small, tired smile. "I don't think—" "I know." She turned toward the exit, her reflection following her across the glass doors. For a moment, she stood there, watching herself in the faint afternoon light, the uniform, the worn shoes, the exhaustion that had nothing to do with work. Then she pushed the door open and stepped out into the wind. Upstairs, Victoria Crane was watching from her office. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. The plan had worked exactly as intended. The rumor had matured into a consequence, and the consequence had been signed, stamped, and delivered, order restored, or so she told herself. That evening, when Alexander returned from an external meeting, The air in the building felt strange, too quiet. People moved quickly, avoided his eyes. He noticed the absence before he even knew its cause. The familiar figure with the cleaning cart gone. He asked Evelyn, "Where's the cleaning staff?" The usual woman. "Bennett." Evelyn hesitated, then exhaled. "Sir, she's been suspended." He stopped mid-step. "Suspended." "For what I don't know all the details," Evelyn said carefully. "Something about misconduct. HR handled it this afternoon." He stared at her, disbelief flickering into anger. "Misconduct? Yes. Sir." He turned toward his office, the sound of his footsteps sharp against the marble. Inside, he shut the door and stood in silence for a long moment. He didn't sit, didn't move, just felt the weight of his own creation pressing down on him. The system he had built, the one that prized control above compassion, had acted exactly as it was designed to. Swift, merciless, blind. And he realized, with a cold clarity, that he had no one to blame but himself. He picked up the phone. "Get HR on the line," he said. Minutes later, the HR director's voice came through, polite and professional. "Mr. Hawthorne, how can I help? I want to know why an employee named Claire Bennett was suspended," he said, his tone measured but low. There was a pause. "Sir, I'm not sure I'm authorized to discuss individual personnel matters." "You are now?" The woman's voice faltered. It was a precautionary step. "Sir, we received multiple complaints suggesting inappropriate involvement between her and upper management." "Upper management?" he repeated flatly. "You mean me?" Silence. He let it stretch, heavy and deliberate. "Did anyone verify those claims?" We're still in the process." "Sir?" "Who filed them?" "I don't have that information at hand." "You do," he said. "Find it, and call me back in 10 minutes. He hung up before she could answer. For the first time in years, Alexander felt something close to rage, not the sharp, commanding kind that drove meetings, but the deep, hollow anger of a man facing the monster he'd raised. He had built this place to reward obedience, not courage, and now that obedience had turned against the only person who dared to tell him the truth. He walked to the window. Outside, the city pulsed beneath him, lights flickering in thousands of rooms, each one holding its own small story of survival, somewhere out there. Claire was walking home, probably thinking it was over, that he had abandoned her. He whispered to the glass, "You didn't deserve this." The HR director called back within minutes, voice tight. "Sir?" The original complaint came from Victoria Crane's office. He closed his eyes briefly. Of course it did. When he hung up, he didn't speak for a long time. Then he reached for his coat. Evelyn looked up as he passed her desk. "Sir? Are you leaving early?" "Yes." "Do you need the car?" "No," he said. "I need a walk." He stepped out into the cold air, the city stretching before him like a living, breathing mirror of all the choices he'd made. For years, he had mistaken silence for order, but silence had never kept peace. It had only buried injustice under polished floors. And now it had taken someone honest, someone innocent, and turned her into collateral. He walked until the streets blurred, until the neon lights softened against the drizzle. Somewhere above, a billboard glowed faintly. Hawthorne Dynamics built on excellence. He stopped and looked up at it, rain gathering in his hair, his suit darkening with each drop. The slogan felt cruel now. Excellence, he thought, meant nothing if it came at the expense of fairness. And as he stood there, the noise of the city around him, traffic, footsteps, life felt like judgment. He turned toward the building again, its tall glass windows reflecting him back like a ghost of the man he'd been. Inside that reflection, something cracked, not loudly, just enough to let a little light through. Tomorrow, he decided, would not be like today. Not if he could help it. The next morning, the city was still half asleep when Alexander arrived. The security guard at the front desk startled at the sight of him. He wasn't expected this early. He didn't nod, didn't smile, just walked straight to the elevator with a pace that carried purpose instead of power. His reflection followed him up, glass wall after glass wall, until the doors opened onto the top floor. The conference room lights flickered on as he entered. The long table stretched before him like a courtroom bench, and he its judge and defendant both. For years, this room had been the seat of control. No one ever spoke here unless permitted to. But today, Alexander didn't want silence. He wanted truth. He placed his briefcase on the table, opened it, and set a single sheet of paper in front of him, the HR report suspending Claire Bennett. He read it again, slowly, as if testing his own endurance for shame. Words that twisted decency into suspicion. Words he knew he'd allowed to exist by doing nothing for too long. When the executives began filing in, their chatter died the moment they saw his face. Victoria was the last to enter, immaculate as always, calm, confident. She took her usual seat near the end of the table, her folder neatly closed, her eyes unreadable. "Good morning," Alexander said quietly. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of something unspoken. "Take your seats." They obeyed. He stood at the head of the table, both hands resting on the wood. The skyline behind him glowed faintly with morning light, the kind that exposes more than it softens. "Before we discuss today's agenda," he began, "there's something I need to address." The room was still. Yesterday, an employee named Claire Bennett was suspended by Human Resources. He continued. The reason given was inappropriate behavior involving senior leadership. He paused, eyes sweeping the table. That leadership, apparently, is me. The silence broke into murmurs, nervous, low, like wind in the dark. Alexander waited for it to settle, then said evenly, "I want to make something perfectly clear. There was no misconduct, no relationship, no impropriety of any kind." His tone sharpened, not in volume, but in conviction. "She is not my mistress. She is the only person in this building who's ever had the courage to tell me the truth." He let the words sink in. They didn't echo, but they landed with force. Across the table, Victoria's jaw tightened ever so slightly. "Alexander," she began carefully, "perhaps it's best we discuss this privately." "No," he cut in. "Privately is how this company hides its rot. We'll discuss it here, with everyone." Her composure wavered, only slightly, but enough. "I was under the impression HR was acting in the company's best interest," she said. "There were rumors, and who started them." She hesitated, her lips parting, but no sound coming out. He looked at her for a long moment, then turned to the rest of the table. "For years, I've prided myself on building a system that runs efficiently, that rewards precision, obedience, control." He took a breath. "And yesterday, that same system punished an honest worker for telling the truth." The executives exchanged uneasy glances. No one moved. "I created this culture," Alexander continued. "A culture where silence is safer than honesty, where fear keeps order. And now I see what that silence costs." He picked up the HR report and tore it cleanly down the middle. The sound of paper ripping filled the room. "Claire Bennett will be reinstated immediately, with full pay and an apology from management, effective today." A stunned pause followed. Then one of the junior board members spoke, hesitant. "Sir, are you certain that's wise?" "The optics. The optics." Alexander's tone hardened. "Do you know what it looks like to do nothing while an innocent person's reputation burns?" The young man fell silent. Alexander straightened, looking down the length of the table. "We've built something powerful here, but power without justice corrodes from the inside. It becomes something smaller, something cruel." He glanced toward Victoria again. "And that's not the company I intend to run." Victoria's eyes flashed. "You're letting your emotions cloud your judgment?" He studied her quietly. No, Victoria. I'm finally letting my conscience in. Her expression froze. For a moment, no one dared breathe. Then Alexander turned toward Evelyn, who stood by the door taking notes. Draft the reinstatement letter, he said softly. And send it to HR before noon? Yes. Sir? He exhaled slowly, as if shedding years of weight. Also, he added, initiate an internal review of how this situation was handled. Every decision, every name attached to it. His gaze lingered on Victoria for a beat longer than necessary. When the meeting adjourned, no one moved right away. They just sat there, watching the man they thought they knew different. Unrecognizable in the best way. He didn't look powerful now. He looked human. After everyone left, Victoria approached him quietly. Alexander, she said, her voice low, controlled, you're making a mistake. Compassion doesn't build companies. He turned to her, meeting her gaze. Neither does fear. She blinked, caught off guard. For once, she had no reply. He nodded toward the door. That will be all? Victoria. When she left, he sank into the chair at the head of the table, his fingers tracing the grain of the wood. The room was quiet again, but not the same kind of quiet. Not the kind born of intimidation. The kind that follows a storm when the air finally feels clean. Later that day, Claire received a call. The voice on the other end was formal, but trembling slightly. Miss Bennett, this is HR. We'd like to inform you that your suspension has been lifted. You're welcome to return to work tomorrow. She didn't say anything for a long moment. When she finally did, her voice was calm. Thank you. After the call ended, she sat on the edge of her bed, hands folded in her lap. The apartment was still, sunlight spilling through the window onto her worn floorboards. For the first time in days, she felt the tightness in her chest ease. In his office, Alexander looked out at the city, the light shifting across the skyline. He wasn't proud, just aware that this was what leadership should have always been. Not control, not fear, the courage to do what's right, even when it costs you something. He whispered to the glass, as if to the version of himself he'd finally outgrown. Not power, just justice. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, casting the faintest golden hue over the city below. It wasn't redemption yet, but it was a beginning. The day Claire returned to work, the building seemed to breathe differently. People watched her quietly as she stepped through the glass doors, not with the same suspicion as before, but with a quiet curiosity, even respect. She wore the same uniform, the same steady expression, yet something about her presence had changed. She no longer looked like a temporary worker. She looked like someone who belonged. Alexander met her that morning in the lobby. No press release, no grand gesture, just a nod that said more than words. Good to have you back, he said softly. Good to be back, she replied. He gestured toward the elevator. Walk with me. They rode in silence to the top floor, the hum of the elevator filling the space between them. When the doors opened, he led her to the same conference room where, days before, he'd torn apart the system that had condemned her. Now, on the table before them, lay something new: plans, notes, drafts of what would become the first cultural reform initiative in Hawthorne Dynamics history. We're going to change how this place breathes, he said, from the inside out. Claire glanced at the stack of papers, then at him. You really think they'll let you? He gave a small smile. They don't have to let me. They just have to keep up. That was how it began. At first, the partnership was formal structured meetings, data reviews, policy drafts. But as the weeks went on, the rhythm between them shifted. Claire wasn't afraid to challenge him, and he didn't try to silence her. He found her perspective uncomfortably honest, yet strangely grounding. She reminded him that the company wasn't built of reports and profits. It was built of people. She'd sit across from him, her hands folded, speaking plainly about things no one else dared to. The fear, the exhaustion, the quiet resignation that came before every resignation letter. And he listened, really listened. Sometimes, after long meetings, they'd walk through the lower floors together, observing without announcing who he was. Alexander would watch the way employees straightened their posture, the quick glances of unease that passed when they didn't recognize him immediately. He'd see the walls he had built unspoken, invisible, but heavy, and he'd feel the weight of his responsibility. Claire would notice the same things, but with different eyes. She saw the tired receptionist who never took lunch breaks, the intern who flinched when spoken to too sharply, the janitor who hurried past executives like he was apologizing for existing. These are the cracks, she'd say quietly, the ones no audit will show. He'd nod, jotting notes, her words echoing louder than the sound of his pen. They began holding small forums with staff no titles, no ranks, just people talking. At first, the employees were hesitant. Years of caution didn't fade easily. But when they realized their CEO wasn't there to reprimand but to understand, something shifted. One night, after the last session, Alexander lingered in the empty room, the smell of coffee and faint laughter still hanging in the air. Claire was packing up notes, her hair falling loosely around her face. "You were right," he said. "It's not the work that breaks them. It's the silence." She looked up, eyes soft but steady. "You built the silence. You can break it too." He smiled faintly. "With your help. Maybe." There was no flirtation in his tone, no unspoken tension. Just quiet respect, the kind that grows between two people who have walked through fire and decided to build something better from the ashes. But even as they worked, whispers began again. This time, quieter, more dangerous. People noticed the late meetings, the private discussions, the way he deferred to her opinion. It didn't matter that what bound them wasn't romance, it was vision. Power didn't like equality. Victoria Crane saw it first. From the edge of every meeting, she was no longer invited to lead. The sight of them, Alexander listening, Claire speaking, lit a slow fire beneath her calm. By the third week of reform planning, Alexander received an internal memo from the communications department. It was polite, but pointed concerns have been raised about your recent public collaboration with a former janitorial staff member. Some fear it blurs professional boundaries. He set the paper down, exhaled slowly. "Boundaries?" he murmured. "That's what they call it." That afternoon, he found Claire in the cafeteria, reviewing survey forms with a group of mid-level managers. He waited until they dispersed, then said, "They're already starting to push back." She looked up from her papers. "You knew they would." "Yes." He hesitated. "But I didn't think it would bother me this much." She studied him for a moment, seeing past the composed surface to the man still learning how to carry doubt. "It bothers you because it's personal," she said. "You're trying to fix something you helped break. That's never easy." He nodded slowly, then smiled. "You really don't pull your punches, do you?" "I don't know how," she said simply. For a while, they just stood there, surrounded by the soft hum of conversation. It wasn't comfort exactly, but it was something close. That night, Alexander sat alone in his office, the skyline stretching endless outside. He reviewed their plans again, each note written in two different hands, his precise and methodical, hers flowing, full of life, two ways of seeing the same thing, two languages that somehow spoke the same truth. He thought about how much she'd changed the air in this place, how much she'd changed him, not by demanding it, but by being unafraid to exist as she was. Downstairs, Claire locked up the supply room, her shift done. She was tired, but it was the good kind of tired, the kind that comes from purpose. When she stepped outside, the night air was cool against her face. She looked up at the tall building she once feared and whispered, "Don't stop now." Upstairs, as if he'd heard her from miles away, Alexander looked at the last page of their reform draft, a sentence she had written in her looping handwriting, "Let people speak, and they will build something worth listening to." He read it twice, then 3 times. The corners of his mouth softened. The road ahead would not be kind. Power rarely surrendered without a fight. But, for the first time, he wasn't alone. He turned off the lights, his reflection fading into the dark glass. Two people, one purpose. And somewhere between them, change was taking its first, fragile breath. It began on a Monday, a morning like any other until the phone started ringing. At first, it was subtle. A few curious glances in the lobby, a sudden hush near the coffee machines. Then, within an hour, the air inside Hawthorne Dynamics grew thick heavy with whispers, electric with speculation. By noon, it wasn't whispers anymore. It was news. An online business journal had published the headline, "Inside Hawthorne Dynamics." The CEO's secret relationship with a former janitor. The photo beneath it was grainy but unmistakable. Alexander and Claire, walking side by side through the glass corridor weeks earlier. To anyone who didn't know better, it looked intimate, deliberate, a story waiting to be believed. Within hours, other outlets picked it up. Office romance scandal. CEO's reform project tied to personal affair. Every headline twisted what had once been honest collaboration into something sordid and scandalous. Victoria Crane watched the chaos unfold from her office, the faintest smile playing on her lips. She didn't have to say a word. The storm she'd started was doing the work for her. By afternoon, the building felt divided. Some believed the rumors, others didn't, but no one said so out loud. Silence had returned, this time wrapped in curiosity and fear. Claire didn't see the headlines until Maria ran to her, holding up her phone with shaking hands. "Claire, you need to read this." She did, slowly, carefully. Then she put the phone down on the cleaning cart and said nothing for a long time. Her face didn't show anger, just weariness, the kind that seeps in when you realize truth isn't always strong enough to defend itself. "I knew something like this would come," she said quietly. Maria's eyes widened. "You think it's true?" "No," Claire said softly. "I think it's desperate." But no matter what she said, the looks that followed her that day said everything else. In the hallways, eyes trailed her like shadows. People stopped talking when she passed. Even those who had once smiled at her now turned away, afraid of being caught in someone else's storm. By evening, she made her decision. She went home, sat at her small wooden table, and began typing a letter. Her fingers moved slowly, deliberately, as if every word cost her something. "Dear Mr. Hawthorne, this company deserves its chance to change, but not through the noise of my presence. For that reason, I'm stepping away. Thank you for listening, for seeing me, and for trying to build something better. Don't stop now. Claire Bennett." She printed it, folded it neatly, and placed it in an envelope with her badge. When she dropped it off the next morning at the front desk, the receptionist looked startled. "You're quitting," Claire nodded. "No, just leaving before I become the reason something good gets destroyed." Upstairs, Alexander was in his office when Evelyn entered, pale and hesitant. "Sir, you should see this." She handed him her tablet headline after headline, flashing in rapid succession. He scrolled once, twice, then stopped. His jaw tightened. His pulse quickened. But what hurt most wasn't the accusations. It was the photo. That moment so small, so ordinary had been turned into proof of something ugly. "Who leaked this?" he asked, voice low. "We're still checking," Evelyn said carefully. "But the story originated from a reporter with ties to Victoria Crane's PR firm." He didn't speak. He just turned toward the window. The skyline reflected faintly in the glass. "Of course," he murmured. Then, almost as an afterthought, "Where's Claire?" Evelyn hesitated. "She dropped off a letter this morning. She's gone." For a long time, he said nothing. The silence between them stretched until it filled the room. Then, quietly, "Thank you, Evelyn." When she left, he unfolded the letter. He read it twice, tracing her handwriting with his thumb. Every line was calm, unaccusing, no plea, no bitterness, just a quiet dignity that somehow made the pain worse. He sat back in his chair, the noise of the city echoing faintly outside. For the first time, he felt what it truly meant to be alone, not the isolation he'd once chosen, but the kind left behind when someone brave enough to tell you the truth decides to walk away. The board called an emergency meeting that afternoon. Cameras were waiting in the lobby, journalists pressed against the glass doors like vultures scenting blood. Inside, the executives were divided. "We need to issue a denial immediately," one said, "or a settlement," said another. The stock's already dropping. Victoria, sitting with her arms crossed, looked composed. "Our focus should be damage control," she said. "We can't let personal issues overshadow leadership." Alexander lifted his gaze slowly. "Personal issues?" he repeated. "That's what you call it." She smiled faintly. "Perception is reality." "Alexander, you taught me that." He stood then, the chair sliding back with a sharp sound. "No," he said quietly. "That's what I used to believe. Reality is what happens when you stop hiding behind perception." He took a deep breath. "And the reality is, a good person has been driven out of this company by lies and by the very culture I created." The room went still. Victoria's composure cracked, just a hairline fracture. "You're saying this was my doing? I'm saying you're what this place used to be," he said softly, "and I won't let it go back." He turned toward the window, the skyline stretching beyond the glass. "We built this company on fear, and fear breeds cowards. I won't be one anymore." When he left the room, the air felt different. Some watched him go in silence, others exchanged wary glances, but just a few looked inspired. That night, Alexander didn't go home. He stayed in the office long after everyone had gone, Claire's letter still on his desk. He read it again and again until the words blurred. Then he folded it carefully and placed it inside his jacket pocket, close to his chest. Outside, reporters waited for a statement, cameras ready. But he didn't come down, not yet. He stood by the window, looking out over the same city that had made him powerful, and now demanded he prove he deserved it. The question lingered like smoke in the air. Protect his name, or protect the truth. He already knew his answer. He just needed the courage to say it out loud. And as the night deepened, the lights of the city reflected in his glass office countless, unblinking, watching. The flash of cameras began before Alexander even stepped onto the stage. A wall of lights, voices, and anticipation, all aimed at him. The conference hall felt smaller than usual, the air heavy with the tension of a spectacle about to unfold. Rows of journalists lined the room, microphones jutting forward like weapons disguised as questions. He adjusted his tie once, not out of vanity, but habit. His hands trembled slightly, a rare betrayal he couldn't control. Evelyn stood near the curtain, eyes steady, a silent anchor in the chaos. "They're ready for you, sir," she said softly. He nodded, but before stepping into the light, he reached into his jacket pocket and touched the folded letter, Claire's letter. The paper was worn now, edges softened by rereading. Her handwriting had faded slightly, but her words had not. "Don't stop now." He inhaled slowly. Then he walked out. The sound hit him like a wave, the clicking of shutters, the low hum of murmured speculation. He took his place behind the podium, the Hawthorne Dynamics logo glowing faintly behind him. For a moment, he just stood there, looking out at the sea of faces, some curious, some hungry, some waiting for his fall. He leaned toward the microphone. "Good afternoon," he began. His voice was calm, but it carried something heavier than confidence conviction. "I called this press conference today to address the rumors circulating about me, about my company, and about a woman named Claire Bennett." The noise in the room quieted instantly. Alexander paused, scanning the crowd. "You've all seen the headlines, the photos. You've heard the words affair, scandal, inappropriate relationship. And maybe you came here expecting me to deny it all, to protect my name." He exhaled softly. "But I didn't come here to protect my name. I came here to protect the truth." A few reporters leaned forward, pens poised. He continued, voice steady. "Claire Bennett was not my mistake. She was my reminder." A ripple of confusion moved through the audience. he went on. She reminded me that leadership isn't about control. It's not about fear or power or how many people obey when you speak. Leadership is about listening, about humility, about courage that doesn't need a title. He looked down at the podium, then back up, his expression clear, unguarded. I used to believe silence was strength. That authority came from keeping others small. Claire showed me I was wrong. She looked me in the eye one day and said, "You confuse control with leadership." And I've never heard truer words. The cameras flashed again, capturing the stillness between each sentence. His voice dropped lower, slower. I built a culture of fear. I let people suffer under it. And when someone finally told me the truth, I almost let the system I created destroy her. He took a step away from the microphone. No script, no PR-approved language, just a man, speaking to the noise he'd once commanded. I won't let lies define her. Or me. So, for the record, there was no affair. There was respect. There was honesty. And there was change. The reporters whispered among themselves. Some scribbled faster. Others just stared. Alexander let the silence linger, then said, quietly, "You want a story? Here it is. A CEO met a woman who cleaned his floors, and she told him the truth. That's it. That's all. But that truth was powerful enough to change the way I lead, the way I live, and the way this company will move forward." He looked down for a moment, hands gripping the edges of the podium. The cameras kept clicking, relentless, but he no longer noticed. "You call it scandal," he said softly. "I call it awakening." A hush fell over the room. He took one final breath, as if choosing between two worlds, the one he had built and the one he wanted to believe in. Then he spoke the line that would echo beyond that room. "She is not the reason I fell. She is the reason I finally stood up." The words hung there, suspended, weightless yet heavy enough to silence even the boldest reporter. For a moment, no one moved. Then, a single camera flash broke the stillness, and then another, and another. Questions began to rise, shouted names, half-formed sentences, but Alexander stepped back, removed the microphone, and placed it gently on the podium. He didn't need to say more. As he left the stage, Evelyn met him backstage with a look that was part fear, part awe. "That was unexpected," she whispered. He managed a tired smile. It was necessary. Outside, the world reacted in real time. Some called it foolish. Others called it brave. Investors panicked. Employees watched the live stream from their desks, breath caught in their throats. Somewhere, in a small apartment across the city, Claire watched too. The flickering light from the TV danced across her face as she listened. The moment she heard him say her name, she froze. But when he said the words, "She's the reason I remember what real leadership means," her eyes softened. She didn't smile, not exactly. She just sat there, silent, tears barely forming, but her hands pressed to her heart. He had done it. He had spoken when silence would have been safer. Hours later, Alexander stood alone on the rooftop of Hawthorne Dynamics. The city stretched out beneath him, a constellation of moving light and noise. But up here, it was still. He thought of what he had lost: his image, perhaps his position, maybe even the fragile trust of those still loyal to the old order. But beneath the fear was something cleaner: freedom. He pulled Claire's letter from his pocket once more. The paper fluttered in the wind, but he held it steady. "Don't stop now." He smiled faintly. "I didn't." Below, the hum of traffic carried faintly upward. The storm had broken, but for the first time, the air felt light. He knew the backlash would come: the board meetings, the press cycles, the judgment. But he also knew something else: he had finally stopped lying to himself. And in that truth, for the first time, he felt whole. Somewhere, the city lights blinked like small, steady heartbeats, each one a reminder that courage doesn't roar. Sometimes, it just speaks, quietly, clearly, and the world listens. Morning sunlight spilled through the tall glass walls of Hawthorne Dynamics. washing the lobby in gold. It was the same building, same marble floors, same polished steel elevators, yet somehow it felt different. The air carried a quiet hum, not of fear, but of life. People talked softly, laughed in corners, greeted one another without glancing over their shoulders first. The kingdom of silence had fallen. Alexander walked through the lobby with no entourage, no barrier between him and his people. He carried only a coffee cup and a simple notebook. A few heads turned as he passed, but this time the looks weren't of dread. They were of curiosity, respect, even warmth. The company had changed not overnight, not without pain, but piece by piece, like a broken mirror being carefully reassembled. They called it the Speak Up Initiative, meetings where anyone, from janitors to department heads, could share ideas or concerns, anonymous feedback that actually led to change, an open-door policy that was more than words. And at the heart of it all was her. Claire stood at the front of the new training hall, a bright space filled with plants, open windows, and round tables instead of long, intimidating ones. She wore no uniform now, just a simple white blouse and dark slacks. Her hair was tied back, her eyes calm but alive. The plaque on the wall behind her read, "Speak Up, a Culture of Listening." She looked out at the group of new hires seated before her, wide-eyed, nervous, hopeful. "When I first walked into this building," she began, "I used to keep my head down. I thought silence meant safety. But I learned that silence, in the wrong place, can become its own kind of harm." Her voice was steady, unhurried. "What we're building here isn't perfect. It won't always be easy, but it's honest. And that's where real work begins." For a moment, the room was still. Then someone clapped. Another joined in. Soon, the space filled with applause that felt genuine, the sound of belief, not obligation. Outside the glass walls, Alexander watched from a distance, not as a CEO, but as a witness. The pride in his eyes wasn't the kind born of ownership, but of redemption. He'd learned that leadership wasn't about standing above others, it was about standing beside them. Victoria Crane's name had not been spoken in weeks. The investigation that followed the scandal had been quiet but thorough. One morning, her office was found empty, her desk cleared, her access revoked, no press statement, no farewell speech, just absence the kind that comes when a legacy ends not with fire, but with silence. Her departure didn't feel like victory, it felt like balance. As the weeks went on, small but powerful things began to happen. The receptionist who used to keep her voice low started greeting people by name. A junior designer suggested a new workflow and saw it approved within a week. Maintenance staff no longer walked with their eyes down. And Alexander. He listened. He attended meetings not to command, but to learn. Sometimes, he'd sit quietly in the back, taking notes, leaving before anyone noticed he'd been there. The man who once ruled through silence was now the man who filled it with understanding. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and the city turned to amber, he found himself standing by the same conference table where it had all begun, the spotless surface that had once carried the weight of pride and pretense. He ran a hand along its edge, remembering that morning when Claire had dared to say, "There's no stain, sir." He smiled faintly. Turns out, she was right. Behind him, he heard footsteps. Claire stepped in, carrying a folder and a mug of tea. "You're not supposed to be working this late," she said, her tone light. "Old habits," he replied. She set the mug down near him. "Then maybe it's time to trade them for better ones." He looked at her, the corners of his mouth softening. "You've managed to change this entire company. Claire." She shook her head. "No, people change themselves. I just reminded them they could." There was a quiet between them, not tense, not awkward, just full. Alexander turned toward the window, watching the skyline flicker. "You ever think," he said slowly, "how strange it is that a single act of honesty can shift an empire?" She smiled, faint but real. "Honesty's louder than we think. Sometimes, it just needs someone to hear it." He nodded. Then let's keep listening. For a while, they stood side by side, watching the city pulse below. The building hummed faintly around them, the sound of people working, laughing, creating, a company alive again. The following week, a new plaque appeared in the main lobby, simple brushed steel, mounted on the marble wall. It read, "To every voice once silenced this place listens now. No signature, no fanfare. But everyone knew who had written the words." Months later, journalists would revisit the story. Some would call it a corporate miracle, others a redemption arc. But to those inside the building, it wasn't a headline, it was a heartbeat. And for Claire, every morning began the same way. She'd walk through the front doors, nod at the receptionist, and breathe in the air that used to taste of fear, now warm with possibility. She'd glance at the plaque, touch its cool surface, and whisper quietly, "We did it," from somewhere up on the higher floors. Alexander often saw her crossing the lobby, and though they didn't always speak, he'd smile not as a man who had saved her, but as one who had finally learned from her. The company had changed, the people had changed, he had changed, and for the first time in years, the light that poured through the windows wasn't just morning light. It was forgiveness. It was renewal. It was everything silence had once stolen, now returned. And yet, in that peace, somewhere deep inside, he knew the story wasn't over. There was more beyond these walls, more voices waiting to be heard. And Claire, she was already listening. The first snow of winter drifted gently past the tall glass windows of Hawthorne Dynamics. It was quiet inside, not the heavy, fearful quiet that once ruled the place, but the kind that comes when everything is at peace. Alexander stood by his office window, watching the flakes swirl in the pale morning light. The city below moved slowly, softened by white. Somewhere out there, he knew. Claire was walking through that same snow, not toward this building anymore, but toward something new. She had left 2 months ago, not abruptly, not out of anger. Just quietly the way she'd arrived, but lighter somehow. Her last day had been simple, no speeches, no ceremony, only a hug from Evelyn, a handshake from the board, and a long, wordless look from Alexander across the lobby. He had said, "You built something here that will last," and she had smiled, that small, steady smile of hers. Then, "Let's make sure it keeps growing." Then she was gone. Now. Her name came up in conversations like a soft echo. Claire's idea, Claire's program, Claire's words. She had become part of the foundation, not by title, but by truth. A few weeks later, news spread of her new project, Voices Rising, a grassroots initiative helping low-income workers and service employees find their voice, their courage, their dignity. She'd built it with donations from employees, former colleagues, even strangers who had watched her story unfold online. Alexander followed her work quietly. Every so often, an article or a short video would appear a photo of her standing before a group of bus drivers or speaking with janitors in a high school gym, her sleeves rolled up, her face lit by conviction. He never reached out. He didn't need to. Some connections speak without words. One morning, he arrived at his office to find a small envelope sitting neatly on his desk. No courier, no signature, just his name, handwritten in looping ink. He knew that handwriting instantly. Inside was a single postcard. On one side, a photo of a coastal town cliffs, waves, sunlight breaking through clouds. On the other, a few words written in her familiar hand, still speaking, still changing, still me. He stared at the message for a long time. Then he smiled. It was the kind of smile that starts in the heart before it reaches the lips, soft, private, filled with gratitude. He placed the postcard against the window frame, where the morning sun could touch it. Then, as he often did now, he walked down to the cafeteria. The space was filled with voices easy, open, alive. Employees chatted over breakfast, sharing ideas freely, no hushed tones, no careful glances toward authority. Just people being themselves. When the young intern at the counter noticed him and stood up nervously, Alexander simply waved. "Good morning," he said. The intern blinked, surprised. "Morning, sir." Alexander smiled. "It's Alex, actually." She laughed a little. "Okay." Alex. As he sat down with his coffee, he realized something: the company no longer needed him to hold it together. It had found its rhythm. It was breathing on its own. He sipped slowly, watching the light shift across the room. Every voice here mattered now. Every person had space to speak, to disagree, to dream. For years, he had built walls of control, thinking they would protect the company. But it wasn't the walls that had made it strong. It was the people who finally dared to speak inside them. He thought again of the postcard, still speaking, still changing, still me. That was her legacy. Not rebellion, not defiance, but continuity. The courage to keep truth alive, even when no one's watching. Later that afternoon, as he returned to his office, he paused by the lobby plaque. "To every voice once silenced, this place listens now." He traced a fingertip over the letters, feeling their weight. Then he whispered, "And it always will." The snow outside had stopped. The city glowed faintly in the dimming light, rooftops glistening like quiet promises. For a long moment, he stood still, listening to the soft hum of life below, conversations, laughter, footsteps, all blending into one living rhythm. It was the sound of a world learning how to breathe again. He turned off the lights in his office, leaving only the soft gray of evening. The postcard by the window caught the last bit of sun, glowing faintly. Alexander lingered there not as a man defined by his past mistakes, but as someone shaped by them, someone who had learned that truth, once spoken, never really disappears. It moves forward, carried in new voices, new hearts. And as he stepped out into the hall, the echo of those voices followed him, not loud, not demanding, just steady, like waves against the shore, somewhere beyond the skyline. Claire was probably doing the same thing, standing before another crowd, reminding them that silence can be broken, that change begins with a single word spoken out loud. He smiled to himself. Then, quietly, he whispered, still speaking. Outside, the city lights flickered on, one by one, small, glowing signs of life, connection, hope. And in that fading evening light, he realized the simplest, truest thing of all: when someone dares to tell the truth, its echo never fades. It just keeps finding new voices to live in. Sometimes, the most powerful change begins with a single honest voice. When the room fell silent reminds us that truth, even when spoken softly, can shake the walls built by fear and pride. It teaches that leadership is not measured by control, but by the courage to listen, and that dignity doesn't come from position, but from integrity. For those of us who have lived long enough to see how power can harden people, this story is a gentle reminder: humility is strength, not weakness. When we dare to speak from the heart or listen without judgment, we restore something deeply human in one another. Life will always give us rooms filled with silence, where truth feels dangerous and kindness feels small. But it's in those rooms that our voices matter most. Whether we lead a company, a family, or simply ourselves, the act of listening and telling the truth with respect, with compassion, can change everything. Because real change doesn't happen in noise. It begins in the quiet courage to speak and to hear. Thank you, dear listener, for spending your time with Shining Stories. If this story touched your heart, even just a little, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps these quiet and human stories reach more people who may need a gentle reminder about kindness, courage, and hope. We share new stories every week, stories that speak softly but stay with you long after they end. So, stay with us, and let's keep shining together.